out front now, Sophia Nelson, Vance's former Yale classmate and a close friend. And this is Sophia's first national television interview and an out front exclusive. Sophia, I really appreciate your taking the time here to share these things. And I know that, you took a lot of thought to decide to do this. You and J.D. Vance, of course, were friends, close friends. So I understand you're a transgender public defender in Detroit. Vance now is one of the Republican Party's staunchest culture warriors. So when you look at what you're seeing now, Sophia, J.D. Vance running as Trump's vice president, do you see any of the same person that you knew in law school?
First of all, thanks for having me tonight, Aaron. No, I don't see any of the man that I got to know and care about. It's really heartbreaking to see him become so callous and divisive.
So I want to go to some of these emails that we're grateful you shared. I think it's important for people to understand, Sophia, who he is and who he was. So one of your emails from him, this never before published, Vance says in November of 2016, and I quote, "I really see the racially offensive views of Trump's supporters, not all of them, of course, but it's certainly disproportionate, as coexisting rather than driving his support." I guess let me just ask the question to you this way, Sophia, then, because this is an email and you had many conversations with him. Did Vance believe that Donald Trump himself was racist?
My understanding is that he certainly did, yes.
And so, do you recall any of the conversations you had, the two of you, on topics like that?
I mean, in a series of emails that I've shared with you, he's called Trump morally reprehensible, a very bad man, and he indicated that he wishes Trump would tone down the racism. That all indicates to me that Vance was well aware that Trump trafficked in racism, and that certainly not all, I agree with JD there, not all of the people that voted for Donald Trump are racist. I know that, certainly there are many people who voted for Barack Obama and then voted for Donald Trump. However, there is extreme undertones of prejudice, racism, transphobia, homophobia, Islamophobia that drive the MAGA movement, and is now something that J.D. Vance himself is trafficking in.
And I want to ask you about some of that in a moment. First, though, on the issue of race, I know that Vance expressed to you an openness on the issue of reparations, which obviously is anathema to the Trump position, the MAGA position. He also expressed to you sympathy for the Black Lives Matter movement. And in one exchange with you in these emails you shared with us, Sophia, he was reacting to the killing of Michael Brown, the 18-year-old black man who was shot by a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. So this is an email all the way back from 2014, October. Vance writes you, quote, "I hate the police. Given the number of negative experiences I've had in the past few years, I can't imagine what a black guy goes through." And we just heard a moment ago Vance call police our protectors, and we back the blue in this country. But Sophia, for you, how passionate was he on the issue of police bias and brutality?
I mean, at the time, I believe JD was genuine in the email that you just quoted, and it certainly reflects my experience as a public defender here in Detroit. I watch body-worn camera every day and represent people who the police treat with callous disregard and excessive force. And I think it's a huge problem in this country, and we see it regularly. A young woman was just murdered in her own home. There's been rallies around that recently. I knew JD to be a genuine, thoughtful person who was compassionate towards people who were different from him. And that email, I believed at the time, genuinely reflected his views.
So let me ask you about this, because when you talk about the kind of person that you believed him to be, we did reach out to Vance's office for a comment on your decision to publicly share your correspondence with him, with us. And here's what a spokesperson for Vance says, Sophia. They say, quote, "It's unfortunate this individual chose to leak decade-old private conversations between friends. Senator Vance values his friendships with individuals across the political spectrum. He has been open about the fact that some of his views from a decade ago began to change after becoming a dad and starting a family. And he has thoroughly explained why he changed his mind on President Trump. Despite their disagreements, Senator Vance cares for Sophia and wishes Sophia the very best." Now, I want to ask you about that last sentence in just a moment, Sophia, if I may. But first, what he's saying here is that these issues, of which we've touched on some, from reparations to the police to racism, that this all changed because he had a family, because he became a dad. Do you think that that could be the case?
I mean, I don't live in J.D. Vance's head, obviously, but what I've seen is a chameleon, someone who is able to change their positions and their values depending on what will amass them political power and wealth. And I think that's really unfortunate because it reflects a lack of integrity. This isn't someone who evolved on one or two issues and with new information. This is someone who has changed their opinion on literally every imaginable issue that affects everyday Americans in this country and changed the way they speak about people. So the J.D. Vance that I was friends with for over a decade was compassionate, and we frequently disagreed. That's reflected in the emails. But he always approached conversations with respect and kindness, which I think is so essential. And what we've seen with Donald Trump is a callousness and a cruelty in the way he talks about people, a bullying, right? He's a bully and he calls people names. And when JD decided to run for the Senate in 2022, he started adopting that similar persona, so anathema to who he used to be. And it's reflected in his Twitter, it's obviously reflected in the cat lady's comment, and it was reflected in our interpersonal communications and the end of our friendship. He just started talking in this divisive, dismissive, and cruel way about people who were different from him. And that is just not the person that I used to know.
So I want to ask you about that. First, I just want to say he wrote about you. He did feel a deep connection with you. I just want to emphasize, you're talking about a 10-year friendship. 10 years is a long time to have a deep friendship with a person. You would think you know them well. He wrote about you, Sophia, in Hillbilly Elegy. He says, he's talking about a class, and he says, one of those classes, a constitutional law seminar of 16 students, became a kind of family for me. We called ourselves the Island of Misfit Toys, as there was no real unifying force to our team. A conservative hillbilly from Appalachia, the super smart daughter of Indian immigrants, a Black Canadian with decades worth of street smarts, a neuroscientist from Phoenix, an aspiring civil rights attorney born a few minutes from Yale's campus, and an extremely progressive lesbian with a fantastic sense of humor, among others. But we became excellent friends. Now, just to be clear here, Sophia, the last friend he describes is you. All right, he describes you as the extremely progressive lesbian. And a day after his book is published, he writes to you. He calls you Sophs, which I guess was his nickname for you, and apologizes for referring to you in that way. And he goes on to say, I recognize this may not accurately reflect how you think of yourself, and for that I'm really sorry. I hope you recognize that the description came from a place of ignorance when I first started writing years ago. I hope you're not offended, but if you are, I'm sorry. Love you, JD. So, when you think about that, what does that say about the person that you knew and the support that he, I don't know, was it explicit or implicitly gave to members of the LGBT community?
Well, again, the J.D. Vance that I was friends with, he might not have always agreed with me. We certainly, again, had our differences. And I didn't always agree with him, but we knew how to talk to each other respectfully with kindness and compassion. We were both raised in the Midwest. I'm from a small town in West Michigan, and I was taught we treat others how we want to be treated. And so you don't have to share a faith or a racial background or a political background with your neighbors to treat them with respect and dignity. And JD reflected that in our relationship. And the JD Vance that I knew was supportive of marriage equality and had LGBTQ friends, myself included. And when I had gender-affirming surgery in 2012, JD, delivered me baked goods when I was going through my recovery. Again, he didn't necessarily fully understand a transgender identity, and that's fine. I don't need everyone to do that. What I need from people is a sense of decency and respect, which is, consistent with the Midwestern values that I was raised with and why I returned to the Midwest. I've lived here since 2013. This is where I was raised. And the Rust Belt is filled with a diverse group of working class people who, again, we don't always agree on tax policy, on whether we're cat or dog people, but we know how to treat everyone with kindness.
And, So when you talk about that he brought you baked goods when you went through gender affirming surgery, and I know, Sophia, you're saying that was 2012. So then you had a long time of being friends. My understanding is when Vance came out in support of a state law banning gender affirming care in 2021, which is when he did that, and he's now since proposed a national ban. He's called that surgery that you went through gruesome. Can you share with us how you ended the friendship with him?
I mean, I never explicitly said we're not friends anymore. And I want to be clear, I still care about JD and Usha and their family. You know, deep down, part of me is hopeful that he'll snap out of it or something. I don't know. But that was incredibly hurtful, and I communicated that to him. I communicated that I was disappointed, that I was hurt, and that I was scared, because I remember what it's like to be a kid and think there's something wrong with me, and it's terribly scary. And I thought, I'm never going to be able to be my authentic self because it won't be safe, I won't be accepted, I won't be able to get a job. And I tried to explain that to him. You know, I told him what I went through as a child in response to his public support of criminalizing access to gender affirming care. And he was very dismissive. And again, the tone that I had, you know, been the basis of our friendship across political differences had completely shifted. He had gone from a compassionate, thoughtful, kind person to mimicking Donald Trump's derisive cruelty. And, you know, I have many family members and friends who are independents, who are Republicans. But here in the Rust Belt, we treat everyone with kindness. And that's just, I think, a core value. And it's a core value that J.D. Vance has turned his back on in order to amass money and power.
So you mentioned the family and that you wish JD and Usha well. I know you know her well. You attended their wedding, right? She was that super smart person he was referring to in the book. She was once a registered Democrat, recently worked at a San Francisco law firm, as you well know, Sophia, that describes its culture as, quote, radically progressive. She did clerk, though, for more conservative Supreme Court justices. I mean, there's just so many people who are so curious about her and who she really is and what she really thinks. And she's being subjected to all the things women are subjected to, you know, whether she colors her hair and her makeup and all those things that people do. What can you tell us about her? Do you think she believes in what her husband is currently saying?
Well, I don't think anyone knows what JD or Usha believe, because they have literally changed their principles on every imaginable issue. However, I was never as close with Usha as I was with JD. I will say that the woman that I knew was also incredibly kind and brilliant, a really hard worker, and someone I understood to be kind of a centrist technocrat, and leaning left of center, I would say. Someone who, it's come out publicly, was very upset and frightened by the events of January 6th, as was JD at the time. And so what I think is reflected in both of their changing of their principles on every single issue is that their core value is amassing money and power, not the integrity and kindness that I think are core values of everyone in the Rust Belt.
Sophia, thank you very much for sharing all of this with us. I know you did it after great consideration, and I appreciate it. I know everyone watching does too, so thanks.
Thank you for your time, Erin. And yeah, absolutely. This was a difficult decision for me because, again, I do care about JD, and I'm a private person. I've never been on national TV before. This is not comfortable for me. But I thought the American people had a right to know, and I thought trans kids needed to know that these MAGA people, they're not actually scared of you. They don't think there's anything wrong with you. They're engaged in political opportunism, and you're going to be all right.
All right, Sophia, thank you.